The bell at Zion Missionary Baptist tolled slow and hollow, each strike a fist to the chest. Heat shimmered above the blacktop. A flag-draped casket waited in the hearse's open maw, the blue field and white stars crisp against the July glare. The honor guard stood at attention, gloved hands steady, boots aligned on the chalked curb. In the front row of folding chairs, Naomi Hale, widow, 34, gripped the corners of a damp handkerchief and told herself to breathe. "Ma'am," whispered the funeral director, Mr. Whitaker, the starch of his shirt surrendering to sweat, "we're ready to bring Staff Sergeant Hale inside." They were not. A county cruiser idled sideways across the church drive, lights winking without the siren. Deputy Riker leaned one elbow on the roof, another on his hip, thumb hooked under his duty belt like his authority came standard with the hardware. "Roads closed," he called, not looking at the family so much as past them. "Closed for what?" Whitaker asked, voice polite in the way of a man who knows families best when the ground has just fallen out from under them. "Unpermitted assembly, noise complaints, parking violation up and down Olive Street. Pick one." Naomi rose, slow and careful, like movement might spill what composure she had left. The paper in her palm, her husband's casualty notice, had softened where her tears had pressed through. "Deputy, please, this is my husband's funeral." Riker's gaze moved to the casket, then back to Naomi, something unreadable passing between the two. "City rules are city rules, ma'am. Nobody's above them, not even the army." The honor guard didn't flinch, but one of the younger soldiers set his jaw a shade tighter. Behind them, veterans in VFW caps began filming with their phones. A teenage boy in a JROTC polo lifted his like a periscope. The lens glittered. Pastor Givens stepped forward, Bible under one arm, white collar bright as a strip of sunlight. "Deputy, our congregation obtained the usual permit for procession and service. We've buried men and women in uniform at this very church for 40 years. Riker tapped the roof with 2 fingers. "Permit doesn't cover rifles, Pastor. We got a call about a 21-gun salute in a residential zone. Also, don't cover overflow parking in front of the Fry's driveway." Mr. Fry called twice. Naomi felt the world tilt. "Marcus trained men to save lives," she said, voice small and steady. "He led his squad out of an ambush with a bullet in his shoulder. He taught our son to tie his shoes with one hand." She swallowed. "He gets the rifle detail." "Not here," Riker said. "Not today." Captain Elise Monroe, the casualty assistance officer assigned to the Hale family, broke from the honor guard and approached with measured calm. "Deputy, federal law guarantees military funeral honors. We can adjust, but we won't deny a soldier his rights." She kept her tone even, a pressure bandage on a wound. "This ain't a federal facility," Riker replied. "You want to play big leagues, take it to the base. Out here, we keep the peace." The hum around the church steps thickened. Whispers, the quiet hard click of phone cameras, the kind of waiting that turns into heat all on its own. Naomi could taste the tin edge of panic rising behind her tongue. Somewhere to her left, their 10-year-old Isaiah tightened his grip on Aunt Lila's hand and asked a question too soft to hear. Naomi didn't turn. If she looked at him, she wasn't sure she could hold the line of her spine. Monroe leaned closer to Naomi, low voice for her alone. "Don't engage him. I'm making calls." She stepped back, phone already at her ear, posture still as a rifle in a rack. "This is Captain Monroe requesting immediate guidance from the state liaison. Yes, civilian interference with honors. No, no confrontation yet." The words settled like ash. Whitaker tried again, palms open. "Deputy, we'll move the salute to the burial site. We can bring the casket inside now, begin the service, keep the street clear." Riker flicked his eyes toward the church doors, where an usher held a brass handle that wouldn't turn. A chain threaded the inside latch to an iron rung bolted to brick. A padlock hung like a punctuation mark. "City Fire Marshal ordered the building closed for occupancy limit," Riker said. And there it was. How one no could be followed by a dozen others until grief itself was a trespass. The gathered veterans muttered. Pastor Givens bristled. "I have the key to that door, Deputy. And I have the order says you don't use it," Riker replied. "You force it, I start citations." Naomi's hand found the casket's flag before she realized she'd moved. The fabric was cool where the wind touched it, hot where the sun did. She remembered Marcus folding a towel into sharp corners when Isaiah was a baby, laughing when the boy smacked it apart. "Do it again, Daddy," he'd said. "Make the corners." Monroe's voice cut through, controlled urgency now. Yes, ma'am, the sheriff's office has been notified. No, the deputy hasn't de-escalated. Copy. Yes, I'll remain on scene. Someone in the back shouted, "Let him rest!" Another voice, "Let our soldier in!" The chant lifted, low at first, then fuller, catching like a spark line in dry grass. Riker shifted his stance. A second cruiser rolled up, blocking the opposite end of the drive. Naomi felt the edges closing. She pictured the inside of Zion, the worn hymnals, the scratch in pew 3 from when Isaiah had dragged a toy truck along the varnish. She pictured Marcus's portrait on the easel by the pulpit, the one where his uniform was crisp and his smile tilted left like he'd just thought of something he couldn't wait to tell her. She would not let that picture sit in an empty church while his body waited in a parking lot. She stepped away from the casket and toward Riker until the brim of his hat cast a shadow over her shoes. "Deputy," she said, each word measured, "you are making a mistake that will live longer than this day." For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Monroe angled her phone so Naomi could hear the distant voice on speaker, calm, clipped, belonging to someone who stored authority the way others stored breath. "We've notified the Pentagon duty officer. Maintain posture. Do not escalate. Help is en route." "En route from where?" Whitaker asked, hope and disbelief colliding in his throat. Monroe only repeated, "Maintain posture." But something in her face, something like relief held at attention, changed the air. A wind came up Olive Street, carrying heat and the fainter, foreign sound of engines not usually heard over this neighborhood. Heavy, layered, the thrum of a convoy or rotors or both. Heads turned down the block. The JROTC boy's camera swung like a weather vane. Even Riker's gaze ticked toward the horizon, where sunlight knifed off the leading edge of a line of dark vehicles cresting the hill. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply placed her palm back on the flag, the blue field under her fingers like a night sky finally moving toward dawn. The rumble grew louder, a bass note rolling over the asphalt. Conversations faltered. Even the cicadas seemed to fall quiet. From the far end of Olive Street, black SUVs emerged in formation, their tinted windows reflecting the July sun like dark shields. The convoy rolled steady, deliberate, each tire crushing gravel with the certainty of authority. Naomi's knees threatened to buckle, but she stood straighter, one hand still resting on the flag. Isaiah clutched Aunt Lila's skirt tighter, his eyes wide. "Mom," he whispered, "who are they?" Before Naomi could answer, Captain Monroe lowered her phone, chin lifting. "Defense Department motorcade," she said, voice low but clear enough for the crowd to catch. "That's the Pentagon." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Veterans snapped their heads toward one another, disbelief etched on weathered faces. Phones rose higher, recording every inch of the approaching line of vehicles. Deputy Riker shifted, his jaw tight. The hand on his belt twitched. He hadn't expected backup of this caliber, not for what he thought was just a small-town disruption. His partner, leaning against the second cruiser, straightened and muttered, "What the hell is this?" The convoy pulled up directly in front of the church. Doors opened with precise timing, hinges groaning in sync. Out stepped men and women in suits, earpieces coiled like serpents along their collars. The lead agent scanned the scene with clinical precision before nodding once toward the largest SUV. The door opened, and from the shadow of tinted glass, the United States Secretary of Defense, Charles Ellison, stepped onto Olive Street. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Ellison was tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair cut neat against the collar of his dark suit. His presence radiated command honed over decades, the kind that didn't need volume to dominate a room or a street. He surveyed the chain-locked church doors, the casket glinting in sunlight, the grieving widow clutching the flag. He removed his sunglasses slowly, folding them with deliberate care, and handed them to an aide. Then he spoke, his voice deep, measured, unmistakable. "Who locked these doors?" No one answered at first. The crowd shuffled, eyes darting to Riker. The deputy cleared his throat, puffing up his chest. "Sir, local ordinance—" Ellison cut him off without raising his tone. "Local ordinance does not override federal law. That soldier will receive his honors today." Cheers broke out, low at first, then swelling. Veterans removed their caps, saluting the casket. Pastor Givens lifted his Bible skyward and said, "Amen." Naomi's throat tightened. For the first time since the nightmare began, hope surged warm in her chest. She blinked back tears, gripping Isaiah's shoulder. "That's your daddy's boss," she whispered, barely believing the words herself. Ellison stepped closer to the chain. He gestured to one of his aides, who produced bolt cutters from the back of a vehicle. The crowd gasped as steel met steel. One snap, another, and the padlock clattered to the ground. The sound echoed louder than any siren. Ellison pulled the chain free and tossed it aside, then turned back to Naomi. "Mrs. Hale," he said with a respectful nod, "let's bring your husband home." Naomi's lips parted, but no words came. She simply nodded, hand trembling on the flag. Deputy Riker took a step forward, face flushed. "You can't just—" Ellison pivoted, eyes narrowing. "Deputy, step back. This is no longer your scene." His tone left no room for argument. "If you continue to interfere, I will personally ensure your badge is reviewed by the Justice Department before sundown." The crowd roared with approval. Phones recorded every second, the hashtag already forming in whispers. Let Hale rest." Riker froze. His partner muttered something under his breath and retreated to the cruiser, unwilling to test the weight of Washington's shadow. Captain Monroe moved quickly, directing the honor guard. "Detail, present arms." The rifles rose as one, silver bayonets glinting. Soldiers straightened, boots hammering the asphalt. Ellison himself stepped to the side of the casket, pressing a hand to the flag with reverence. For a moment, the most powerful defense official in the nation stood shoulder to shoulder with a grieving widow, honoring the man whose body lay beneath. Naomi's tears fell freely now, but they were different tears, not of helplessness, but of vindication. Marcus would not be denied. With the path cleared, the honor guard lifted the casket. The weight pressed into their shoulders, but their steps were steady, their faces stone. They moved toward the church doors now swinging open. As the casket passed, Ellison saluted, his hand sharp and sure. Veterans in the crowd followed, caps pressed to hearts. Even Isaiah, mimicking what he saw, raised a trembling hand to his forehead. Naomi leaned down, whispering to her son, "That's for your daddy." Inside the church, the air was cool, the pews filled with mourners who had been waiting, holding their breath through the chaos. The organ began to play, low solemn notes carrying through the sanctuary. Naomi followed close behind the casket, her hand brushing the flag as it passed. Behind her, Ellison entered quietly, not as a politician, but as a soldier honoring another. He took a seat in the front pew without ceremony, bowing his head. Outside, Deputy Riker stood rigid by his cruiser, the weight of dozens of cameras trained on him. His authority, once heavy on the street, now looked brittle under the glare of national power. His radio crackled, but he didn't answer. For the first time in his career, he was utterly silent. And as the first hymn rose inside Zion, Naomi closed her eyes. The fight at the door was over. Her husband would rest with honor. But she knew this moment, the clash of grief and arrogance, the arrival of the nation's highest military voice, would not fade quietly. It was only the beginning. The first hymn rolled through Zion's rafters like a tide. Organ pipes trembled, voices rose, and the flag-draped casket glided down the center aisle toward the altar. Naomi walked just behind, each step heavy but certain. Captain Monroe and the honor guard flanked her, uniforms sharp, rifles gleaming in silent promise. From the front pew, Secretary Ellison stood briefly, bowing his head as the casket passed. His presence was both comfort and shock. A cabinet official sitting among ordinary mourners in a neighborhood church. The cameras of dozens of cell phones caught the moment, their lenses raised like candles in the dim light. The live stream began almost by accident. A teenager in the balcony pressed go live on his phone, and within minutes the feed rippled across social platforms. By the time Naomi sat, millions of strangers were watching. The caption, hastily typed, read, "Cop tries to stop funeral, Defense Secretary shows up." Pastor Givens stepped to the pulpit, his voice resonant, heavy with years of shepherding grief. "We gather not only to mourn Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, but to bear witness that no man's service, no family sacrifice can be chained by arrogance or prejudice. Today, the highest halls of power stand with the lowest pews of faith. That is justice." The congregation thundered with amen. Naomi squeezed Isaiah's hand. He whispered, "Mom, did Daddy know him?" Naomi shook her head gently. "Maybe not in person, but men like that, they carry each other." Outside, reporters had descended like a storm. Satellite vans blocked half the street. Anchors stood in front of Zion's red brick facade, gesturing at the cruisers still idling awkwardly. Words like disruption, Pentagon, and civil rights violation threaded through the airwaves. Deputy Riker remained by his car, face pale. He had tried calling the sheriff wasn't answering. His radio buzzed with static and curt orders, stand down until further notice. Every time he glanced toward the church, cameras caught the sweat shining at his temple. The internet had already named him the cop who chained the doors. Back inside, the service unfolded with solemn rhythm. A childhood friend of Marcus's stood to speak, his voice breaking. He was the one who volunteered first, at school, at practice, and in the army. He believed in protecting people, even people who didn't thank him for it. Naomi closed her eyes, seeing Marcus's crooked grin when he tied Isaiah's sneakers, his steady hands when he lifted her after the first chemo appointment years ago. His whole life had been service. To deny him honors had felt like erasing that life, but Ellison's arrival had carved the truth back into stone. Captain Monroe read a letter from Marcus's commanding officer. He saved 3 men under fire, refusing evacuation until every soldier was safe. His legacy is courage and quiet strength. The words echoed, almost describing Ellison himself as he sat silently, hands folded, a soldier honoring a soldier. In Washington, the live stream reached the West Wing. Advisors huddled around screens. Commentators on cable news cut into regular programming, broadcasting the image of a locked church door, the snapped chain, the defense secretary's hand on a widow's shoulder. Senators tweeted support. Civil rights leaders demanded investigation. The story was no longer local. It was national. Naomi rose finally to speak. She stood at the pulpit, hand gripping its edge as if it were the railing of a ship. Her voice wavered but did not break. My husband believed this country was worth fighting for, even when it didn't always fight for him. Today you saw a door locked against his honor, but you also saw it opened, not just by bolt cutters, but by conscience. If we can open doors like that, maybe we can open hearts too. The sanctuary erupted in applause, tears streaking faces, veterans saluting, strangers hugging. The sound was carried through the live stream to millions more who typed comments by the thousands. Let him rest. Justice in uniform. Naomi Hale speaks for all of us. Outside, Deputy Riker sat inside his cruiser, windows rolled up, hands gripping the wheel. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't want to read. Suspension seemed inevitable, but worse than that was the image replaying in his mind. Ellison's cold eyes, Naomi's steady defiance, the crowd chanting against him. For the first time, his authority had shrunk to nothing. As the service neared its end, Ellison stood. The sanctuary fell silent. He didn't take the pulpit, he simply faced the congregation. Staff Sergeant Hale wore the uniform of this nation, he said, voice low but firm. And in that uniform, he gave all he had. Today we return honor to him, not as a favor but as a debt. His legacy reminds us that the measure of a nation is how it treats those who carried its flag. He paused, scanning the pews. On behalf of the Department of Defense, I salute him. And I salute all of you, for standing when others tried to silence. He raised his hand to his brow, holding the salute. Every veteran followed. Even Isaiah lifted his small hand. Naomi pressed her hand to her chest, tears flowing freely. When the bugler played taps, the notes curled through Zion like smoke, soft and final. Outside, the crowd beyond the doors stood still, listening. Even reporters lowered their microphones. And when the last note faded, the casket was borne out again. This time not halted but carried with reverence to the waiting hearse. The rifles fired their salute in the cemetery beyond town, each crack a punctuation mark of dignity. Naomi stood taller than she thought she could, Isaiah beside her, Ellison and Monroe flanking the family. The fight at the church steps had ended, but the ripple had only begun. By the next morning, the story had broken free of Olive Street and spread like wildfire. Every major network carried the same image, the chained church doors, the defense secretary standing at Naomi Hale's side, and the honor guard lifting Marcus's casket high against the July sun. Anchors spoke in urgent tones. A black soldier's funeral nearly blocked by local police, until Secretary Ellison himself intervened. Hashtags flooded timelines. Let Hale rest. Open the doors. Hashtag honor our soldiers. Clips from the live stream circulated with millions of views. Naomi's words, if we can open doors like that, maybe we can open hearts too, were replayed across channels. Commentators called her the widow who spoke for the nation. For Naomi, waking to the storm of attention was surreal. She sat at her kitchen table, Isaiah still in pajamas beside her, both staring at the TV as if watching strangers. Her own voice filled the room. She reached to turn down the volume, hand trembling. "Mom," Isaiah said, his eyes wide. "That's you! You're on TV!" Naomi forced a small smile, brushing his hair back. "Yes, baby. But today, we'll just be us." Meanwhile, Deputy Riker's name had leaked. His photograph circulated online, paired with headlines labeling him the cop who chained the church. His inbox overflowed with angry messages, some threatening. His phone rang without pause. By midday, the sheriff's office announced an internal investigation. Reporters camped outside the precinct, demanding answers. Riker tried to leave through a side door, but was swarmed by cameras. "Deputy, why did you block a soldier's funeral?" one shouted. "Do you regret your actions?" another pressed. He kept his head down, muttering, "No comment." But the clip of his silence only made the outrage louder. At the Pentagon, Ellison's staff fielded calls from senators and governors. Civil rights leaders demanded congressional hearings. Veterans organizations pledged rallies. For Ellison, the decision to intervene had been instinctual, an obligation, not a choice. But now, the weight of politics pressed in. In a briefing room, he addressed the press. "What happened in that small town is unacceptable. Federal law guarantees military funeral honors. No one budge, regardless of uniform or badge, has the authority to strip that away. We will ensure this never happens again." His words hit headlines within minutes. Defense Secretary promises reform. Back in her neighborhood, Naomi couldn't step outside without cameras waiting. Neighbors tried to shield her, offering rides, bringing meals, but the attention felt overwhelming. She wanted privacy to grieve, yet strangers insisted on hugs, thanks, or interviews. Dana, her childhood friend, sat with her on the porch. "You don't have to speak for the world, Naomi," she said gently. "You already did your part." Naomi sighed. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted Marcus to rest." "But maybe," Dana said, "that's why your voice matters, because you didn't ask for it. You lived it." Naomi looked at Isaiah playing quietly in the yard, his toy soldiers lined in perfect rows. Her husband's discipline already shaping their boy. She wondered if this burden, the spotlight, the scrutiny, was now part of his legacy too. News vans rolled into town by the dozens. Reporters sought anyone connected to Marcus Hale. Old teammates, childhood friends, even teachers were interviewed. Every story painted the same picture, a man of honor, duty, and sacrifice. The contrast with Riker's pettiness was stark, undeniable. At Zion Baptist, Pastor Givens unlocked the doors once more, this time for community vigils. People came not just to mourn Marcus, but to stand against the injustice of what had happened. Candles lit the steps at night, signs reading, "Honor Our Heroes," leaned against the brick. In Washington, committee chairs announced hearings into racial bias in law enforcement, citing the Hale funeral as a tipping point. Analysts compared it to past civil rights clashes, moments where a local injustice became a national reckoning. Commentators debated Ellison's unusual decision to appear in person. Some praised his courage, others questioned the precedent. But one truth was clear. Marcus Hale's funeral had become more than a family's private grief. It was now a mirror held to the country. Naomi wrestled with that truth. Late at night, when Isaiah finally slept, she sat at the dining table surrounded by letters. Handwritten notes from strangers, folded drawings from children, emails printed by friends who managed her inbox. One letter caught her eye. It came from a Gold Star mother in Texas. "I buried my son last year. No cameras, no headlines, just quiet pain. Watching you stand at that chain door gave me strength. You weren't just fighting for Marcus, you were fighting for all of us." Naomi pressed the paper to her chest, tears spilling again. She hadn't wanted to fight. But perhaps the fight had chosen her. Deputy Riker, meanwhile, sat alone in his darkened living room, blinds drawn against the protests gathering outside. His badge lay on the table, heavy as lead. He told himself he was only enforcing rules, but even he no longer believed it. Every replay of the chain snapping, of Ellison's cold glare, twisted in his gut. His career teetered on the edge. His name was ruined. And for the first time, he began to understand the scale of what he had tried to stop. Naomi stepped onto her porch one evening, looking at the candles glowing on Zion's steps down the block. She heard voices singing hymns, the same hymns that had filled Marcus's funeral. She closed her eyes, whispering to the night, "Rest easy, my love. They can't chain you anymore." And across the nation, millions who never knew Marcus Hale whispered the same. By the first weekend after the funeral, Olive Street was no longer just a neighborhood road. It had become a gathering place. Veterans in full dress stood shoulder to shoulder with young activists in hoodies. Families brought children, holding candles or waving small flags. The steps of Zion Baptist, once chained, now glowed nightly with rows of flickering lights. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the crowd like restless stars. Chants rose into the night. Honor our heroes! Justice for Marcus! Open every door! Naomi watched from her porch with Isaiah at her side. She hadn't asked for marches or chants. She wanted quiet, wanted her son to sleep without the hum of megaphones. Yet, as she listened, she realized the noise wasn't chaos. It was solidarity. Marcus's name was no longer a target of denial. It was a rallying cry. Isaiah tugged her hand. "Mom, are they here for Daddy?" She nodded, throat tight. "Yes, baby, they're here because your daddy mattered." In Washington, the protests were impossible to ignore. Senators quoted Naomi's words on the Senate floor. "If we can open doors like that, maybe we can open hearts too." Civil rights leaders called for Rikers firing and for federal oversight of local law enforcement practices. Ellison sat in his Pentagon office, reports stacked high. His aide briefed him, "Sir, hearings are being scheduled. The Hale funeral is officially the centerpiece." Ellison rubbed his temple, exhaustion in his eyes. "Let them have their hearings. But make sure the Hale family isn't dragged through the mud. They've carried enough." Riker, meanwhile, lived under siege. Protesters camped outside his home. His mailbox overflowed with hate mail. Former colleagues avoided him, unwilling to share the stain. His phone buzzed with interview requests from networks hungry for a defensive soundbite. He ignored them all, blinds drawn. Yet even in silence, the noise of his downfall was deafening. Naomi tried to retreat into routine. She cooked breakfast, folded laundry, walked Isaiah to school. But strangers stopped her everywhere. At the grocery store, at the gas pump, thanking her for standing strong, for speaking truth. Some pressed her hands with tears in their eyes. Dana drove her home one afternoon, groceries in the back seat. "You've become a symbol, Naomi," she said gently. Naomi shook her head. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want to be a wife who buried her husband." Dana glanced at her. "Sometimes symbols don't get to choose. They're made by the moment, and yours was that door." Naomi stared out the window, the image of the padlock burned forever in her mind. She hadn't chosen that moment, but perhaps she couldn't run from what it had become. The media frenzy only grew. One morning, Naomi's front yard filled with cameras as reporters shouted questions. She stood on her porch, hand on Isaiah's shoulder, and spoke carefully. "My husband served with honor. What happened at his funeral should never happen to any soldier, to any family. I ask for respect. For him. For our son. For all who serve. That's all I want." The clip ran across the nation. Headlines declared, "Widow of Staff Sergeant Hale pleads for respect." Editorials called her voice steady, human, and undeniable. Meanwhile, in small towns and big cities, vigils multiplied. People who had never met Marcus lit candles in his honor. Veterans groups organized flyovers. Schools held assemblies, telling children about courage and sacrifice. Naomi received boxes of letters daily. One came from a Marine in California. "Your husband's story reminded me why I wear this uniform. He gave me back my pride." Another from a schoolgirl in Ohio. "I drew your husband with angel wings. My daddy says he's a hero." Naomi kept them all in a shoebox, though the box was already overflowing. Ellison returned to Olive Street quietly one evening, without cameras. He visited Naomi, sitting on her porch as Isaiah played nearby. "I came to check on you," he said simply. Naomi studied him. The most powerful defense official in the nation looked weary, almost fatherly in the dim light. "You've done enough already," she replied. Ellison shook his head. "Not yet. Marcus deserves more than one intervention. He deserves reform." Naomi whispered, "And what about us? My boy? Me?" Ellison met her eyes. "You deserve peace, and I'll do what I can to help give it to you." For the first time, Naomi felt the weight of her grief shared, not just acknowledged. Across town, Riker finally broke his silence. Cornered by a local reporter in a grocery parking lot, he muttered, "I was just doing my job." The clip spread instantly. Commentators shredded him. Doing his job? His job was to honor, not to humiliate. The sheriff's office announced he was suspended without pay pending review. For Riker, the chains he had wrapped on the church now bound his own career. As autumn cooled the air, Olive Street remained lit with candles each night. Zion Baptist became a pilgrimage site for veterans and citizens alike. The padlock that once sealed its doors sat on display in the vestibule, not as a relic of shame but as a symbol of triumph over arrogance. Naomi stood there one Sunday, Isaiah beside her. He touched the padlock gently. "This tried to stop Daddy," he said. Naomi pulled him close. "Yes, but it didn't, and it never will again." She realized then that Marcus's story had transcended their private grief. It had become part of something larger, a movement for dignity, for honor, for justice. And as the sun dipped low, Secretary Ellison's words from the funeral echoed in her heart. "The measure of a nation is how it treats those who carried its flag." Marcus had carried it with courage. Now the nation was carrying his name. 2 weeks after the funeral, Naomi Hale sat at her kitchen table, sorting through yet another stack of envelopes. Sympathy cards, donations for Isaiah's education, even invitations to speak at schools and churches. Her dining room had become a mailroom. The shoebox where she had been keeping letters now had 3 companions stacked neatly in the corner. As she opened one more envelope, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut made her answer. "Mrs. Hale, this is Linda Barrett from the Senate Armed Services Committee. The committee is holding hearings on military funeral honors and civil rights. We would like to invite you to testify in Washington." Naomi blinked, pressing the phone harder to her ear. "Me? I'm just a widow. I don't know anything about law." Barrett's voice was calm, respectful. "You know what it feels like to have your husband's dignity denied. That makes you the most important voice we could hear." Naomi's hands trembled. She looked across the room at Isaiah, drawing quietly with crayons, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "I'll think about it," she whispered. That night she called Dana. Her friend listened carefully, then said, "Naomi, you don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to be yourself. If you speak, millions will listen, not because of your title, but because of your truth." Naomi sighed. "I'm so tired of being seen. I just want quiet." Dana placed a hand on hers. "Sometimes God doesn't give us quiet. Sometimes He gives us a platform." Meanwhile in Washington, preparations for the hearings were underway. Secretary Ellison briefed the committee privately. "The Hale case isn't isolated. There are gaps in enforcement, and those gaps are being exploited. If we want to honor every soldier, we need stronger protections." A senator leaned forward. "Will you back Mrs. Hale's testimony?" Ellison nodded. "Absolutely. Her voice carries more weight than mine ever could. She's the conscience in this story." Deputy Riker watched all of this unfold from his living room, television flickering in the dark. His suspension had turned into a likely dismissal. He was under investigation for misconduct, and every night his name was dragged through the headlines. His bitterness grew, but so did his awareness that the world had shifted beyond him. The chains he had wrapped on Zion's door now bound only him. When Naomi finally agreed to testify, the Defense Department arranged travel. Captain Monroe returned to escort her, reassuring her every step. "It's just like telling your story to a friend," she said. "Only this time, the whole country's listening." Isaiah clutched Naomi's hand at the airport, wide-eyed at the sight of soldiers saluting as they passed. For him, the trip was an adventure. For Naomi, it was a battlefield of words. The morning of the hearing, cameras crowded the Capitol steps. Naomi walked between uniformed aides, her black dress simple, her expression steady. Reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Hale, what do you plan to say? Do you hold the sheriff's office responsible?" She didn't answer. She held Isaiah's hand tighter, whispering, "Eyes forward, baby." Inside the chamber, senators filled the dais. The room was packed with veterans, advocates, and press. Naomi sat at the witness table, a microphone before her, her heart pounding. To her right, Secretary Ellison offered a small nod of reassurance. When it was her turn, she adjusted the microphone with trembling hands. The room hushed. "My name is Naomi Hale. My husband, Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, served this nation for 12 years. He died believing in the flag that draped his casket. On the day we tried to bury him, we were met not with honor, but with a locked door." Her voice steadied as she continued. "No family should ever stand outside their house of worship, holding grief in one hand and chains in the other. What happened to us wasn't just about one deputy. It was about whether this country truly honors the sacrifices of its soldiers, black, white, all of them." The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras. Naomi lifted the casualty notice she had carried since that day. The paper softened from her tears. This is what the Army gave me when Marcus died. I ask you, Senators, don't let this notice be followed by another notice to another family that their soldier's honor was stolen at the door. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, though the chair had to gavel it down. Senators leaned forward, some visibly moved. Reporters scribbled furiously. Naomi exhaled, relief flooding her chest. After the hearing, Ellison spoke briefly. Mrs. Hale's testimony is a reminder that dignity is not optional. We will enshrine protections so no one can ever deny a soldier's rights again. Naomi stepped outside into the swarm of cameras. She didn't give a statement, she didn't need to. Her words in the chamber were already echoing across the nation. Isaiah tugged her hand. Mom, you sounded like Daddy. Naomi knelt, tears filling her eyes. I hope so, baby. I hope so. That evening, news anchors replayed her testimony, calling it the moment that shook the Capitol. Hashtags trended again. Naomi speaks, #honor for Hale, #never again. Editorials praised her courage, some calling for new laws named in Marcus's honor. Naomi, back in her hotel room, turned off the TV and held Isaiah close. We did what we could, she whispered. For the first time since Marcus's death, she felt something close to peace. The day after Naomi's testimony, newspapers across the country carried her face on their front pages. Some showed her holding the folded casualty notice, others froze the moment when she declared, no family should ever stand outside their house of worship, holding grief in one hand and chains in the other. Editorials poured in. The Washington Post called her a conscience for the nation. The New York Times declared her testimony the spark for long overdue reform. Cable news ran her words on a loop. Naomi herself sat in a quiet hotel room with Isaiah curled up beside her, cartoons flickering on the screen. She flipped through the papers, her own image staring back at her. It felt unreal, like she was reading about someone else. Captain Monroe knocked softly and entered. Mrs. Hale, I thought you should know. The Senate is drafting a bill. They're calling it the Hale Act. Naomi's breath caught. After Marcus? Monroe nodded. Yes, it will guarantee that every service member's funeral honors are protected under federal enforcement, with penalties for interference. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. For the first time, Marcus's name wasn't just on a casualty notice or a headstone. It was on a piece of legislation that could change lives. Meanwhile, back in Olive Street, Zion Baptist still glowed every evening. Candles lined the steps, and visitors came from neighboring states to leave flowers or flags. Pastor Givens told reporters, this church has seen storms before, but never chains across its doors. Those chains broke more than once that day. They broke open the nation's conscience. Local businesses offered free meals to veterans. Schools held assemblies about service and sacrifice. The small town had become a symbol, a place where injustice met resistance and dignity prevailed. Deputy Riker, however, saw none of this as redemption. He sat in his living room with the blinds drawn, watching endless replays of Naomi's testimony on the news. His suspension was now indefinite. Internal affairs leaked that dismissal was likely. His phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, most furious. Even family members urged him to apologize publicly, but his pride bristled. I was just doing my job, he muttered again and again, though even he no longer believed it. When a reporter caught him at a gas station and asked, do you regret chaining the doors? He froze, words jammed in his throat. His silence, captured on camera, became another viral moment. One more nail in the coffin of his career. In Washington, senators moved swiftly. The Hale Act gained bipartisan support, a rare occurrence in a divided chamber. Veterans groups lobbied fiercely. Civil rights organizations hailed it as progress. Within weeks, the bill was scheduled for a floor vote. Secretary Ellison addressed the press. We owe it to Staff Sergeant Hale and to every soldier before and after him to ensure their dignity is protected. No door will ever again be locked against honor. His words echoed Naomi's, deliberately weaving her truth into policy. For Naomi, the spotlight was suffocating at times. Every interview request, every headline, every stranger who stopped her in public was a reminder of her husband's absence. One evening, back at her home, she broke down in Dana's arms. I didn't want to be a symbol, Naomi sobbed. I just wanted to bury him. Dana stroked her hair, whispering, I know, but Marcus's life was bigger than Olive Street. And now, so is yours. Despite her fatigue, Naomi continued to appear when asked. She spoke at a veterans rally in Atlanta, her voice steadier now. I'm not a politician. I'm not a leader. I'm just a woman who loved her husband. But if my voice can help another family avoid what we endured, then I will keep speaking. The crowd erupted with chants. Hale, Hale, Hale. Veterans saluted, children waved flags. Naomi's knees trembled, but she held her head high. Meanwhile, Isaiah carried his father's story to school. During show and tell, he brought the folded flag given at the funeral. Standing in front of his classmates, he said, "This is my daddy's flag. He was brave. They tried to stop his funeral, but people came and helped. Now he's a hero for everyone." The teacher wiped tears as the class clapped. For Isaiah, it was a proud moment. But for Naomi, hearing about it later, it was bittersweet. Her son was growing up with the weight of legacy on his small shoulders. Back at the Pentagon, Ellison prepared for the Hale Act vote. His aides handed him briefing papers, but he kept one photo tucked in the folder. Naomi standing at the pulpit, casualty notice in hand, her face etched with both grief and resolve. This, he told his staff, tapping the photo, is why we fight the bureaucracy. Policies matter, but people remind us why. The night before the vote, Naomi sat on her porch with Isaiah asleep inside. The cicadas hummed, the candles still burned at Zion, and she whispered into the warm air, "Marcus, they're saying your name in places we never dreamed. Maybe this is how you keep serving, even now." A breeze rustled the flags left on the church steps. She closed her eyes, imagining Marcus's laugh, his steady presence. For the first time, she felt not only grief but pride. Pride that his story had broken chains far beyond Olive Street. The Senate chamber was packed tighter than usual, reporters filling the press gallery, veterans crowding the visitor seats, their caps a patchwork of branches and wars. At the center of it all sat the Hale Act, a piece of legislation born not from a policy think tank, but from the grief of a widow on Olive Street. Naomi watched from a reserved seat near the front, Isaiah perched beside her, swinging his legs nervously. Captain Monroe sat on her other side, posture rigid, eyes forward. Naomi's palms were damp against the folded casualty notice she carried like a talisman. One senator rose to speak. "Colleagues, we are not voting on a partisan issue today. We are voting on dignity itself. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale gave his life for this country. His family was denied honor by chains on a church door. This bill ensures that never happens again." Applause broke out, rare and bipartisan. Naomi squeezed Isaiah's hand, whispering, "Listen close, baby. They're saying Daddy's name." Across the nation, screens flickered with live coverage. In diners, airports, schools, and veterans halls, Americans leaned closer. The image of Naomi testifying weeks earlier replayed in short clips before anchors explained the stakes. Hashtags trended again. Hale Act, honor. Our heroes, has never again. In Olive Street, Zion Baptist filled with townspeople watching on a projector. Pastor Givens led a prayer as the chamber roll call began. As senators cast their votes, eye after eye, the outcome became clear. The Hale Act was passing with overwhelming support. The final tally rang out, 91-9. The chamber erupted in applause. Veterans saluted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Naomi covered her face with her hand, tears slipping through her fingers. Isaiah bounced in his seat, whispering loudly, "We won, Mom! Daddy won!" Secretary Ellison, seated a few rows away, rose to his feet. He turned toward Naomi and saluted her, a gesture that carried the weight of every soldier he represented. The chamber followed one by one until Naomi, caught off guard, rose shakily and placed her hand over her heart. News alerts blazed across phones within seconds. Hale Act passes Senate in landslide vote. Networks cut to footage of veterans in the gallery wiping their eyes, of Naomi holding Isaiah close. Commentators spoke of history being written not by generals or presidents, but by a grieving family's courage. That evening, the House of Representatives echoed the Senate's vote, passing the bill with similar fervor. By nightfall, the president stood at a podium in the East Room, pen in hand, Naomi and Isaiah flanking him. Cameras flashed as he signed the Hale Act into law. "Today," the president declared, "we honor Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, and through him, every service member who has ever carried our flag. No family will ever again face locked doors when they seek to lay their loved one to rest." He handed the first signed copy of the bill to Naomi. She accepted it silently, tears streaming, Isaiah clinging to her arm. Back in Olive Street, Zion Baptist's bells tolled as news spread. The candles on its steps multiplied, people cheering and hugging. Veterans raised their flags higher, children held signs reading, "Thank you, Hale family." Even those who had never met Marcus felt ownership of the victory. It wasn't just Naomi's battle anymore, it was everyone's. For Riker, the news was devastating. Watching coverage from his darkened living room, he saw Naomi standing beside the president, saw senators praising Marcus's name, saw the nation unite against the very act he had committed. His suspension turned into termination the following day. His badge was taken quietly, but his disgrace was public. He had become the cautionary tale in every broadcast. Naomi, however, struggled to reconcile the attention with her grief. That night in her hotel room, after the signing ceremony, she stared at the framed copy of the Hale Act on the table. Isaiah slept soundly on the bed, clutching the folded flag. Dana called, "You did it, Naomi. You turned pain into change." Naomi whispered, "I didn't want to. I just wanted Marcus back." Dana paused. "And now he's back in another way. His name will protect families forever. That's bigger than any one of us." Naomi nodded silently, gazing at the words Hale Act printed across the parchment. For the first time, pride began to rise alongside sorrow. The next Sunday, Naomi returned to Zion Baptist. The sanctuary was overflowing. Locals, reporters, strangers who had traveled hours just to be there. Pastor Givens welcomed her to the pulpit, the crowd erupting in applause as she approached. She held the casualty notice in one hand and the signed Hale Act in the other. "This paper," she said, raising the notice, "told me my husband was gone. This paper," she lifted the law, "tells me his name will live on. Together, they remind me that grief and hope can share the same heart." The congregation wept and cheered. Veterans saluted. Isaiah stood proudly at her side, clutching his father's photo. That night, Naomi sat on her porch, the candles at Zion flickering in the distance. She whispered to the quiet air, "Marcus, your fight isn't over, but it's safer now because of you." A breeze stirred the trees, soft as a reply. She closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest. When the president's signature dried on the Hale Act, the ripple effects began instantly. News anchors called it a rare moment of unity. Editorials declared it a victory written by grief but sealed in justice. Across social media, families of fallen soldiers posted photos of folded flags with the caption, "This is for Marcus." In towns from California to Maine, veterans' halls hosted impromptu celebrations. At one American Legion post in Ohio, an old sergeant stood and raised his glass. "That widow in Georgia fought for us all," he said. The room roared with cheers. Naomi watched some of the coverage from her living room. Isaiah curled against her side. For once, there were no cameras outside, no microphones thrust in her face, just mother and son, staring at a nation that seemed, for a moment, united. "Mom," Isaiah whispered, "does this mean Daddy's story will be in my history book?" Naomi brushed his hair back, tears pricking her eyes. "Yes, baby. And not just his story, your story too." In Olive Street, Zion Baptist overflowed with visitors. People who had never set foot in Georgia came to lay flowers, light candles, and take photos beside the padlock that once barred the door. Pastor Givens placed it in a glass case in the vestibule, calling it a relic of both injustice and triumph. Tour buses began arriving on weekends. Some locals grumbled about the attention, but most recognized the moment's gravity. Their small town had become a landmark in a national reckoning. Meanwhile, Secretary Ellison returned to Washington, hailed as a decisive leader. But in private, he deflected praise. "This wasn't about me," he told aides. "It was about a widow who refused to back down and a soldier whose service deserved honor." Still, he knew the Hale Act would be tied to his legacy, and he carried that weight carefully, determined not to exploit it for politics. For Naomi, the transition from grieving widow to national figure was disorienting. Invitations flooded in, from universities, veterans organizations, even international groups. Some asked her to speak on justice, others on resilience. At first, she declined them all. "I'm not a speaker," she told Dana. "I'm just trying to raise my boy." But Dana urged her gently. "Naomi, people don't want a polished politician. They want your truth. That's what moved them in the first place." Reluctantly, Naomi agreed to one. A memorial event at Arlington National Cemetery. The trip to Arlington felt heavier than Washington had. As she and Isaiah walked among rows of white headstones stretching like waves, Naomi felt Marcus's presence sharper than ever. When she took the podium, her hands shook, but only for a moment. My husband's story began with service and ended with sacrifice, but it didn't end at all. Because of him, doors across this nation are open wider. The Hale Act isn't just his name, it's his voice still speaking. And I ask you all to keep listening. The crowd rose in applause, veterans saluting, families weeping. Naomi stepped back, heart pounding, but a strange calm settled over her. She had spoken again, not for cameras, but for Marcus. Back in Olive Street, Deputy Riker's world continued to collapse. His dismissal became official. Protesters moved on, but the stigma remained. His name was shorthand for arrogance, his photo a meme under the caption, "This is what not to do." Even he began to accept that his career was finished. In a rare moment of reflection, staring at the empty badge case on his desk, he muttered, "I locked the wrong door." Nationally, the Hale Act sparked new conversations. States introduced similar measures for first responders, teachers, even healthcare workers, ensuring dignity in moments of service and sacrifice. Commentators called it the Hale effect. In classrooms, teachers used Naomi's testimony as a civics lesson. Children wrote essays about courage, sacrifice, and respect. Some mailed their assignments to Naomi, who stacked them in a growing pile beside the shoebox of letters. One essay stood out. It read, "Heroes aren't just the ones who fight wars. Sometimes heroes are the ones who fight for respect." Naomi pressed the paper to her heart, whispering, "That's Marcus, and maybe that's me too." Ellison invited Naomi back to the Pentagon, this time not as a witness but as a partner. He showed her a draft of new guidelines for military funerals worldwide. "Your husband's name will stand not just in law but in every manual, every briefing," Ellison explained. "It will be part of how the next generation of soldiers is honored." Naomi nodded, overwhelmed. "He would have hated the spotlight," she said softly. Ellison smiled faintly. "Then maybe he would have loved the result. Quiet dignity. That's what we're aiming for." That evening, Naomi returned home to Olive Street, where candles still burned outside Zion. She and Isaiah lit one more, their small flame joining hundreds. Isaiah looked up at her. "Mom, do you think Daddy can see all this?" Naomi knelt, cupping his face. "I don't just think it, baby. I know it, and I think he's proud." As the bell tolled softly in the night, Naomi realized something had shifted. Grief was still heavy, but it no longer stood alone. It was joined by purpose, by legacy, by the knowledge that Marcus's life, and her fight, had reshaped the nation. The days following the Hale Act's passage blurred into a whirlwind for Naomi. She had expected, perhaps, a quiet return to Olive Street, the chance to tuck Isaiah into bed without news vans parked outside. But instead, invitations multiplied. Universities, churches, civic organizations, even military academies. Each envelope carried the same plea. "Come speak. Tell us what happened. Help us learn from your story." At first, Naomi stacked them in a shoebox with the letters from strangers. She told herself she wasn't ready, that she was just a mother, not a leader. But the weight of the shoebox grew heavier by the day. One evening, Dana stopped by, flipping through the invitations. "Naomi, they're not asking for a speech. They're asking for your truth. You've already given it. Now they want to hear it again." Naomi shook her head. "I never wanted to be a symbol." Dana smiled gently. "And yet, here you are." The shift became undeniable when a major news magazine printed Naomi's face on its cover beneath the headline, "The Widow Who Changed Washington." The photo showed her at the Capitol, casualty notice in hand, Isaiah clutching her arm. Naomi winced when she saw it on the grocery shelf, but strangers approached her with tears in their eyes. "Thank you," they whispered. "Because of you, my father's service will be remembered." She realized then that the story was no longer hers to hide. It belonged to everyone Marcus had inspired. At Zion Baptist, Pastor Gibbons devoted a Sunday sermon to Marcus. "One man's life can ignite a movement," he preached. "One widow's courage can unlock doors across the nation." Naomi Hale has shown us that symbols aren't born. They're forged in grief and carried by truth. The congregation applauded, but Naomi lowered her head in the pew, Isaiah's hand in hers. She wasn't sure she could live up to the pedestal others placed her on. Yet she also knew she couldn't step away now. Meanwhile, Secretary Ellison held a press conference at the Pentagon. Standing before the seal of the Department of Defense, he announced, The Hale Act is only the beginning. We are reviewing all military protocols to ensure dignity for service members and their families. Staff Sergeant Hale's legacy will shape our future. Reporters pressed him with questions about politics, but Ellison deflected. This isn't about politics, he said firmly. It's about respect. His words, echoing Naomi's own, made headlines again. The link between her truth and national policy was now cemented. Deputy Riker, however, faded further into disgrace. His appeal against termination was denied. His name became shorthand for arrogance in training manuals and civil rights forums. A local newspaper described him as a man who chained not just a door, but his own future. He walked the streets of town avoided, whispers trailing him. Once he passed Zion Baptist and saw the padlock displayed in its glass case. People pointed at it, shaking their heads. Riker turned away quickly, ashamed. Naomi reluctantly accepted an invitation to speak at a university in Atlanta. Standing before hundreds of students, she felt the old nervousness, the weight of eyes on her. But when she began to speak, her voice steadied. "I never wanted to be here," she admitted. "I never wanted Marcus's story to be tied to my voice. But the truth is, we don't get to choose the storms that find us. We only get to choose how we stand in them. On Olive Street, I stood because I had no other choice. And somehow, that stand opened doors for others." The students rose in applause, some chanting Marcus's name. Naomi left the stage shaken but also lighter, realizing she could carry the role without losing herself. Back in Olive Street, Isaiah became proud of his father's legacy in ways Naomi hadn't expected. He told his classmates about the Hale Act, showed them photos of the signing ceremony. When asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he said, "A soldier, like Dad." Naomi hugged him tight, both proud and afraid. But she also felt Marcus smiling through their son's determination. Late one night, Naomi sat on her porch with the casualty notice in her lap and the signed copy of the Hale Act beside it. She traced the edges of both papers, one soaked in grief, the other in triumph. "Marcus," she whispered, "they've made us a symbol. I'll keep carrying it, but I'll never forget that before all this, you were just mine." The wind rustled the trees, the candles at Zion flickering in the distance. Naomi closed her eyes, feeling both the weight and the strength of her new identity. She was no longer just a widow. She was the voice of a movement. By autumn, Naomi's calendar looked more like that of a senator than a grieving widow. Invitations stacked high on the dining room table, a keynote at a veterans convention, a panel at a civil rights summit, a town hall in Chicago. Her phone buzzed with calls from journalists and producers. Every week brought another request to tell her story. She tried to keep balance. Mornings were for Isaiah, packing his lunch, walking him to school, listening to him chatter about math tests and playground soccer. Evenings, though, often found her hunched over notes, rehearsing answers, preparing speeches she never thought she'd give. One night, Isaiah sighed from the doorway. "Mom, you're always busy now." Naomi set her pen down, guilt pricking her heart. "I know, baby, but every time I talk about Daddy, I'm making sure people remember him, and people like him." Isaiah tilted his head. "But I remember him already. Isn't that enough?" Naomi pulled him into her lap, hugging him tight. "It's more than enough for us. But not everyone knew him, and now they need to." At Zion Baptist, Pastor Givens noticed Naomi's weariness. After service one Sunday, he said, "You can't pour from an empty cup, Naomi. Remember that." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes I feel like my cup isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who needs this story." The pastor nodded. "Maybe so, but even symbols need rest." Meanwhile, in Washington, the Hale effect continued to ripple. Lawmakers referenced the Hale Act when drafting new protections for first responders. Military academies taught the case as a lesson in dignity. Secretary Ellison, in a televised interview, credited Naomi directly. She didn't just speak as a widow, she spoke as the conscience of the nation. That voice reminded us what we'd forgotten. Naomi watched the clip late at night, torn between pride and discomfort. She never sought to be anyone's conscience. She had simply demanded respect for Marcus. Deputy Riker, however, sank deeper into obscurity. His dismissal became official, his appeal denied. He sold his house quietly, slipping away from Olive Street under cover of night. The town barely noticed. His name was already a cautionary tale in training seminars across the country. For Naomi, the knowledge of his downfall brought little satisfaction. Justice wasn't about his ruin, it was about Marcus's honor restored. As her public role grew, Naomi began to notice the toll on Isaiah. At school, children treated him differently. Some called him the Hale Act kid. Teachers praised his father's story in class, but Isaiah sometimes came home quiet, overwhelmed by the attention. One evening, Naomi found him sitting on the porch steps, chin on his knees. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "They all think I'm special because of Dad," he muttered. "But I just want to be me." Naomi sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You are special, Isaiah, not because of laws or cameras, but because you're his son, and because you're you." He leaned against her, silent, but she felt the tension ease. The turning point came when Naomi was invited to speak at the National Mall during a massive veterans rally. Tens of thousands gathered, flags waving, cameras rolling. The scale was overwhelming, but Naomi steadied herself. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces. Isaiah sat in the front row, Captain Monroe at his side. Naomi took a deep breath. "I never wanted to stand here. I never wanted Marcus's name to become a law or a headline. I only wanted him to rest with dignity. But now I see, his story is bigger than ours. It belongs to all who serve, all who sacrifice. If my voice can remind us to honor them, then I will keep speaking." The crowd erupted, chants of "Hail, Hail," rising like thunder. Veterans saluted, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. Naomi's voice trembled, but she held steady, her heart swelling with both sorrow and pride. That night, back in Olive Street, Naomi sat on her porch, Isaiah asleep inside. The candles at Zion still glowed, the padlock in its glass case catching the light. She thought about Pastor Givens's warning, about Isaiah's quiet struggles, about her own exhaustion. "Marcus," she whispered, "they've given me your mission. I'm trying to carry it, but it's heavy. Some days I don't know if I can." A breeze rustled the trees, as if answering. She closed her eyes, imagining Marcus's steady hand on her shoulder. She realized then that being a symbol wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about showing up again and again, even when it hurt. By the time she rose to go inside, Naomi understood something new. She was no longer just telling Marcus's story. She was shaping her own, one that Isaiah would carry forward, and though the weight was heavy, she would bear it. Because the doors that had once been chained were now open, and she couldn't let them close again. Winter settled across Olive Street, but the story of Marcus Hale traveled far beyond Georgia's borders. News outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa picked up Naomi's testimony, translating her words into dozens of languages. Headlines in Paris read, "La veuve qui a ouvert les portes fermées." In Tokyo, "Respect is survival." The Defense Department began receiving requests from allied nations, asking for copies of the Hale Act and guidance on implementing similar protections. Secretary Ellison briefed NATO partners in Brussels. "This began with one soldier, one family," he said. "But dignity knows no borders." Naomi learned about all this not from officials, but from the flood of letters arriving daily. One came from a widow in Britain. "Your courage gave me strength to stand at my husband's grave with my head high." Another from a soldier in Kenya. "We march under different flags, but your story reminds us we serve the same humanity." Each letter stretched Marcus's legacy further, stitching his name into the fabric of a world he had never seen. One morning, Naomi received a call from the State Department. "Mrs. Hale, we'd like to invite you to join a delegation traveling to Geneva. The United Nations is holding a forum on human dignity in military service. We believe your voice belongs there." Naomi's breath caught. Geneva, the United Nations. It felt impossible, like a leap from Olive Street's church steps to the world stage. "I'm just a widow," she murmured. The official replied gently, "That's exactly why your voice matters." Naomi wrestled with the decision. Dana encouraged her. "Naomi, Marcus fought for more than one neighborhood, more than one country. Maybe this is his story finding its way home." Isaiah, however, frowned when she told him. "But Mom, that's so far away. What if you don't come back?" Naomi knelt, pulling him close. "I'll always come back, baby. And when I go, I'll carry you and Daddy with me." Isaiah thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but bring me something from Switzerland." The trip was unlike anything Naomi had known. Flying across the Atlantic, she stared out the window, remembering Marcus's stories about deployment flights, long hours, cramped seats, men and women carrying both fear and courage. Now she carried grief and hope in equal measure. When she arrived in Geneva, the scale overwhelmed her. Flags from every nation, translators' voices echoing in dozens of languages, delegates in suits and uniforms filling vast halls. Yet when she stepped to the podium, the same truth anchored her as always. I came from a small town where chains once closed the doors of a church. Those chains tried to deny my husband's honor, but they did not win. His story opened doors not just for me, but for a nation. And now I see, for the world, dignity is not American. It is human. The hall erupted in applause, interpreters racing to carry her words into every ear. Cameras flashed, delegates nodded solemnly. Naomi stepped back, her knees trembling, but a fierce pride swelled in her chest. Marcus's story had crossed oceans. Back in Olive Street, Pastor Givens watched the live stream with the congregation. "Look," he said, voice thick with emotion, "from Zion's steps to Geneva's halls. This is what faith and courage can do." The church erupted in cheers, children waving small flags. Isaiah grinned as his classmates crowded around the screen. "That's my mom," he said proudly. Meanwhile, Deputy Riker saw the coverage too. Alone in a dingy apartment far from Olive Street, he watched Naomi's face broadcast across the world. The shame burned deeper than ever. He turned off the television, muttering, "She took it all the way to the UN," but there was no bitterness left. Only the hollow recognition of what he had tried and failed to stop. Naomi's time in Geneva ended with a private meeting of delegates. Over coffee, a general from Canada leaned across the table. "Your words reminded us of something we'd forgotten. Thank you for carrying them so far." Naomi smiled faintly. "I only carried Marcus's story. It carried me the rest of the way." When she returned to Olive Street, the community welcomed her with banners. "Welcome home, Naomi." Children held up signs. Veterans saluted as she stepped from the car. Isaiah ran into her arms, clutching a small Swiss flag she had brought for him. That night, as they sat on the porch, Isaiah asked, "Mom, do you think Daddy would be proud of you?" Naomi held him close, her voice steady. "I don't just think it, baby. I know it." The candles at Zion flickered, casting their glow on the padlock in its glass case. Naomi looked at it and realized the truth. Marcus's story had broken more than chains. It had built bridges. Bridges from Olive Street to Washington, from Washington to Geneva and beyond. The roar of applause in Geneva still echoed in Naomi's ears as she settled back into her modest house on Olive Street. Jet lag pressed heavy on her body, but the comfort of familiar walls was a balm. Isaiah clung to her like she'd been gone for months instead of weeks. "Did you see me on TV, Mom?" he asked breathlessly. "Everyone at school was talking about you." Naomi smiled, smoothing his hair. "I saw, and I heard you told them all about Daddy too." Isaiah nodded proudly, then curled on the couch with his toy soldiers. Naomi watched him, her heart aching for the simple normalcy of motherhood. Dinners, bedtime stories, mornings without reporters. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But peace didn't last. The morning after her return, envelopes once again piled on her porch. Reporters camped at the end of the street. Phone calls buzzed without pause. The world still wanted her voice, but Naomi longed for silence. At Zion Baptist, Pastor Givens found her lighting a candle by Marcus's portrait. "The world has heard you, Naomi," he said softly, "but don't forget, you are allowed to rest." Naomi whispered, "How can I, when every door they open for me feels like Marcus's name is at stake?" The pastor laid a hand on her shoulder. "Then rest in knowing you've already opened the door. It will stay open, even if you step back." Meanwhile, Olive Street itself was changing. What had once been a quiet block now bustled with visitors, veterans, activists, students. The padlock in its glass case became a symbol, drawing people from across the country. Locals nicknamed it the lock that lost. Naomi often avoided the crowds, slipping in through side streets. But one afternoon, she overheard a young girl standing by the display telling her father, "That lady is why I want to be brave." The words pierced Naomi's heart. She realized the symbol wasn't just Marcus, it was her too. Deputy Riker, now living several towns away, tried to erase himself from the narrative, but the story followed him. Whispers in grocery aisles, pointed looks at diners. His shame deepened when he saw news footage of Naomi in Geneva. Her voice translated into languages he couldn't even name. He muttered to himself, "I chained a door and she opened the world. There was no undoing it." His legacy was sealed, just as hers was. Naomi's conflict came to a head one evening when Dana visited. They sat on the porch, the night warm, cicadas singing. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Naomi admitted. "Everywhere I go, I'm not Naomi anymore. I'm the widow who fought the chains. I'm the Hale Act. I'm a symbol." Dana squeezed her hand. "Symbols are heavy, but you don't carry them alone. Look around, veterans, mothers, even kids, they're carrying it with you." Naomi looked out at the candles still flickering on Zion's steps. For the first time, she noticed it wasn't just her neighbors anymore. People from other towns had begun tending the candles, ensuring the light never went out. She realized Dana was right. At school, Isaiah's teacher called Naomi in for a meeting. "Isaiah's grades are fine, she assured, but he's struggling with the attention. He says kids treat him differently." Naomi's chest tightened. That night, she sat with Isaiah on the porch steps. "Sweetheart, I know it feels strange when people see you as part of Daddy's story, but remember, you're more than that. You're your own story too." Isaiah looked up, eyes earnest. "But what if I want to carry Daddy's story too?" Naomi hugged him tight, whispering, "Then we'll carry it together." The following week, Naomi was invited to a small ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, this time not to speak, but simply to stand with other Gold Star families. For once, there were no cameras, no speeches, just silence, folded flags, and the sound of taps drifting across the marble. Standing among them, Naomi realized something vital. She wasn't alone. Her grief was part of a larger community, each family bearing its own chains, each one holding its own key to unlock dignity. That night, back in Olive Street, Naomi lit a candle by the padlock display at Zion. She placed her hand on the glass and whispered, "Marcus, the world has your story now, but I'll keep the quiet parts. The laugh only Isaiah and I knew, the way you folded towels into perfect corners. Those belong to us." For the first time since the funeral, she felt a balance settling. Marcus's legacy belonged to the nation, but his memory, his true, tender memory, still belonged to her. As she walked home, Isaiah running ahead, Naomi felt lighter. She would still speak when needed, still stand when called, but she no longer feared losing herself to the symbol. Because symbols inspire nations, but memories sustain families. And Naomi Hale was determined to protect both. Snow dusted Olive Street like powdered sugar, softening the edges of the church steps where candles still burn nightly. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, but for Naomi, the season carried both warmth and ache. It was her first holiday without Marcus, and though Isaiah's laughter filled the house, silence lingered in the spaces where his voice should have been. Naomi tried to make the season feel normal. She baked gingerbread cookies, let Isaiah hang ornaments, even bought a tree taller than last year. But every time she looked at the star atop it, her heart clenched. Marcus used to lift Isaiah high to place it. Now she had balanced on a chair, Isaiah holding her waist nervously. In the evenings after Isaiah slept, Naomi sat at the kitchen table sorting through invitations. Some were from universities, others from international forums, even one from a documentary film crew. Each one wanted her voice, her story, her grief polished into inspiration. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "How do I carry all this and still be his mom?" she whispered to the quiet room. Dana visited a few days before Christmas, bringing hot cocoa and her steady presence. She glanced at the stack of letters. "Still trying to answer everyone?" Naomi shrugged. "I feel guilty ignoring them. These people believe Marcus's story gives them hope. Who am I to turn them away?" Dana leaned forward. "You're a mother. You're a woman who lost her husband. You're allowed to choose when to speak and when to stay silent." Naomi looked down at her hands, the casualty notice folded neatly on the table. "But what if silence feels like betrayal?" Dana's voice softened. "Betrayal would be forgetting, and you'll never forget." Meanwhile, the Hale Act continued to ripple outward. State legislatures introduced similar bills, citing Marcus's story as precedent. Veterans organizations held workshops on dignity, training local officials to avoid repeating Olive Street's mistake. Secretary Ellison sent Naomi a letter, handwritten, thanking her once again. "You carried more than your share of this fight. Now let us carry it with you." Naomi kept the letter tucked inside her Bible, reading it on days when the weight felt too heavy. On Christmas Eve, Zion Baptist held a candlelight service. Naomi and Isaiah sat near the front, the sanctuary glowing with soft flames. Pastor Givens spoke of light-breaking chains, of hope surviving grief. When the congregation sang Silent Night, Isaiah leaned against Naomi's arm, his small voice joining the chorus. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. For the first time in months, she felt peace settle in her chest, fragile but real. Afterward, several veterans approached her. One, an older man with trembling hands, pressed a small box into hers. Inside was a medal, tarnished with age. "This belonged to my brother," he said. "He never got the honors he deserved, but because of your husband, others will. I want you to have this." Naomi's throat tightened. She tried to hand it back, but the man shook his head firmly. "It belongs with you now." She carried it home, placing it beside Marcus's photo on the mantel. Another piece of legacy, another reminder that her private grief had become public memory. Yet Naomi also felt a shift within herself. She no longer resisted the role the world placed on her. Instead, she sought balance, choosing carefully when to step forward and when to step back. She accepted an invitation to speak at a local school, where Isaiah's classmates listened wide-eyed as she told them about Marcus's courage, but she declined a television interview, choosing instead to spend the day baking cookies with Isaiah. When Dana teased her, Naomi smiled. "I'm learning I don't have to carry every torch, just the ones that matter most." January brought another milestone, the unveiling of a memorial plaque at Zion Baptist. It bore Marcus's name, the date of his service, and the words, "Dignity is not optional." Naomi stood with Isaiah as the cloth was pulled away. The crowd applauded, reporters snapped photos, but Naomi's eyes stayed fixed on the inscription. She whispered to Isaiah, "This is Daddy's voice now, carved into stone." Isaiah traced the letters with his finger, nodding solemnly. "So no one forgets." "No one," Naomi promised. That night, back on her porch, Naomi reflected on the months since the funeral. The chains, the tears, the testimony, the Hale Act, the trip to Geneva, it all felt like a storm that had carried her farther than she ever imagined. But now, in the calm after the storm, she understood her new path. She would not let the world consume her. She would not let her son be defined only by tragedy. Instead, she would weave Marcus's legacy into their lives with care, speaking when it mattered, resting when needed, always remembering. She lifted her eyes to the sky, stars scattered like the flag folded in her living room. "Marcus," she whispered, "I've learned I don't have to be everywhere at once. I just have to be here, strong, steady, for him, for Isaiah, for you." And in the quiet winter air, she felt the truth settle. Grief and hope could live side by side. Balance was possible. By early spring, Olive Street no longer looked like the quiet block Naomi once knew. Tour buses idled nearby, unloading groups of veterans, students, and families who wanted to see the church where it happened. Vendors set up small stands selling candles and flags. Even local businesses posted signs, "Welcome, visitors honoring Staff Sergeant Hale." At first, Naomi felt uneasy with the attention. Marcus's funeral had been intimate, raw. Now it was becoming a story told by strangers. But as she walked Isaiah to school one morning, she overheard a group of teenagers visiting from out of state. "This is where the widow spoke," one said. "She stood right here, and they tried to chain her out, but she didn't back down." Naomi's heart tightened. She hadn't meant to become a landmark. Yet if Marcus's name could inspire courage in young people, maybe Olive Street's transformation wasn't exploitation. It was legacy. Zion Baptist adapted too. Pastor Givens organized weekly tours, not for spectacle, but for education. Visitors learned about Marcus's service, the chains that once barred the doors, and the Hale Act that followed. In the vestibule, the padlock glinted behind glass, a symbol of injustice overcome. "Every relic tells a story," Pastor Givens explained to a crowd one Saturday. "This lock tells us that arrogance cannot bind dignity forever." Naomi stood at the back, Isaiah at her side. The boy tugged her sleeve. "Mom, people talk about Dad like he's a superhero." Naomi smiled softly. "In some ways he was, but he was also just your dad, the one who made pancake faces and fixed your toy trucks. Don't ever forget that part." Isaiah nodded, thoughtful. Meanwhile, Naomi began to engage more with the community. She organized a scholarship fund in Marcus's name for local students pursuing military service or public duty. Donations poured in, surprising even her. Within weeks, they had enough to award 3 scholarships. At the first ceremony, Naomi handed envelopes to the recipients, her voice trembling but proud. "This isn't just money. It's a reminder that service matters, that honor matters. Carry it forward." One recipient, a young woman bound for the Naval Academy, hugged Naomi tightly. "I'll serve in his name," she whispered. Naomi's tears spilled freely. Isaiah also began to step into his father's story in his own way. At school, he volunteered to lead the Pledge of Allegiance. On the playground, he corrected classmates gently when they repeated rumors. "My dad wasn't just the Hale Act," he told them. "He was the reason I know how to ride a bike and whistle." Naomi overheard him once and felt a swell of pride. Her son wasn't letting the world's version of Marcus erase the father he knew. The media, however, remained relentless. One day, a producer called, offering to make a feature-length documentary. Naomi hesitated, torn between wanting to preserve Marcus's memory and fearing exploitation. She confided in Dana. "What if they twist it? What if they make it about politics instead of Marcus?" Dana leaned back, sipping her tea. "Then you set the terms. You've learned by now. Your voice has power. Use it." Naomi thought of Marcus's steady strength, how he never flinched under pressure. She nodded slowly. Maybe it's time his story is told fully. By us, not by others. As Olive Street grew busier, some locals grumbled about traffic and noise, but most embraced the change, proud their town had become a symbol of justice. Businesses thrived, schools benefited, and veterans found a place of pilgrimage. Naomi, however, kept her focus on balance. She continued speaking at events, but she also set aside time just for Isaiah. Movie nights, soccer games, walks in the park. She wanted him to know that beyond the symbol, he still had a mother who was simply his. One evening, after a long day of visitors and interviews, Isaiah climbed into her lap. "Mom, will people ever stop talking about Daddy?" Naomi kissed his forehead. "Maybe one day, but even if they do, we won't. His story will always live with us." Isaiah smiled sleepily. "Then that's enough." That night, Naomi sat on the porch, the candles at Zion glowing in the distance. She thought about how Olive Street had changed, how a single act of arrogance had sparked a national movement, how Marcus's name now carried weight far beyond their town. But she also thought about the ordinary moments that still belonged only to her. Isaiah's laughter, the quiet creak of the porch swing, the memory of Marcus humming under his breath as he shaved in the morning. She whispered into the night, "Marcus, the world knows your name now, but I'll keep the parts of you that were just ours." The breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias, wrapping her in both grief and comfort. She realized then that legacy wasn't just what others remembered. It was what she chose to hold close. And in that balance, between public symbol and private memory, Naomi found strength to keep walking forward. The call from the documentary producers weighed on Naomi for weeks. Each time she opened her email, another reminder blinked. "We'd love to sit down and hear your thoughts, Mrs. Hale." She ignored them at first, afraid of losing control over Marcus's story. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized, if someone was going to tell it, it should be her. One evening, she gathered with Dana and Captain Monroe in her living room. Isaiah listened from the couch, his toy soldiers lined in battle on the carpet. "I don't want them turning it into politics," Naomi said firmly. "Marcus wasn't about parties or headlines, he was about people." Monroe nodded. "Then make that clear. Set the terms. You've already stood before senators, before the world in Geneva. This is no different. Only now, you'll shape how the story is remembered." Dana added gently, "Naomi, stories last longer than laws. The Hale Act will protect funerals, yes, but your voice will remind people why it matters." Naomi looked at Isaiah, who grinned suddenly. "Can I be in it too, Mom? I want to tell them about the pancakes Dad used to make." Her heart melted. "Yes, baby, you can tell them." A week later, a small crew arrived in Olive Street. They set up cameras in Zion Baptist, their lenses capturing the padlock glinting in its case, the candles glowing on the steps. They filmed the quiet street, the memorial plaque, and the families who came to pay respects. Naomi sat for the first interview in her living room, Marcus's photo on the mantel behind her. She clutched the folded casualty notice, her fingers smoothing its worn edges. "I never asked for this," she began. "I only wanted to bury my husband. But when the doors were chained, I realized silence would mean surrender, and Marcus deserved better than that." Her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied. She spoke of Marcus's courage in the army, his laughter at home, the way Isaiah ran to him at the end of each day. She told them about the humiliation of standing outside Zion's locked doors, the relief when Secretary Ellison arrived, and the pride when the Hale Act passed. "He fought for his country," she said softly. "All I did was fight for him." Isaiah joined her for one segment, sitting proudly on the couch. My dad taught me how to ride a bike, he told the cameras, and he told me never to give up. That's what Mom did at the church. She didn't give up. The crew was moved, some wiping tears behind the camera. Naomi hugged her son, whispering, "You're carrying him too, baby." The filming continued over several days. They interviewed Pastor Givens, who spoke of the congregation's shock and resolve. They filmed veterans placing flowers at the memorial, strangers lighting candles, and children tracing Marcus's name on the plaque. Even Secretary Ellison contributed, recording a message in Washington. Marcus Hale's legacy reminded us of the simplest truth, that dignity is not optional. His widow carried that truth into the halls of power, and the nation followed. When production wrapped, Naomi felt both drained and relieved. "Now it's out of my hands," she told Dana. Dana squeezed her hand, "and into the world's, right where it belongs." Months later, the documentary premiered on national television. Naomi and Isaiah sat together on the couch, holding hands as the opening scene played. A slow shot of Olive Street, the sound of tolling church bells, Naomi's voice narrating, "I never asked for this story, but it found me." Viewers across the country wept as they watched the reenactment of the chained doors, the arrival of Ellison, the passing of the Hale Act. They laughed gently when Isaiah described pancake faces, and they applauded when Naomi spoke at Geneva. Social media lit up, the most powerful documentary of the year. Every soldier's family needs to see this. Naomi Hale is America's voice of dignity. Back in Olive Street, crowds grew even larger, but this time Naomi welcomed them. She saw families who came not just to gawk, but to remember. A young boy saluted the plaque, whispering, "Thank you." A grandmother from out of state lit a candle, tears streaking her cheeks. Naomi realized then that Marcus's story had become more than tragedy. It had become hope. Deputy Riker saw the film too. Alone, in the dim light of his apartment, he watched Naomi's steady courage and Isaiah's innocent pride. He turned the TV off halfway through, unable to bear it, but later that night, he turned it back on, forcing himself to see it all. When the credits rolled, he whispered, "I was wrong." It was the closest thing to an apology he would ever give. As spring warmed Olive Street, Naomi stood again on her porch, watching the candles flicker at Zion. She thought of the film, of the Hale Act, of Geneva, of every step since the funeral. "Marcus," she whispered, "your story is everywhere now, but here it's still just us." She closed her eyes, feeling the balance she had long sought, symbol and memory, grief and pride, silence and voice, and she knew she could keep walking forward, because she wasn't carrying the story alone anymore. The world was carrying it with her. The documentary's release didn't just stir hearts for a few weeks, it rewrote Marcus Hale's place in history. Within months, schools across the country began including his story in civics and history curricula. Teachers showed clips of Naomi's testimony before Congress, asking students to discuss dignity, justice, and courage. Naomi first heard about it from Isaiah's teacher. "Your son was so proud," she said with a smile. "He stood up in class and told everyone, 'That was my dad.'" When Isaiah came home that day, he rushed into Naomi's arms. "Mom, Daddy's in my history book." Naomi's throat tightened. She pulled the book from his backpack, flipping to a page that showed a photo of Marcus in uniform, Naomi at the pulpit, and the words, "The Hale Act, 2023. For a long moment, she just stared, overwhelmed by the permanence of it. "See, Mom?" Isaiah grinned. "Now no one will ever forget him." Naomi kissed his forehead, whispering, "No, baby, they never will." Olive Street, too, adapted to its new role. The town council approved funds to build a small visitor center beside Zion Baptist. Inside, exhibits displayed Marcus's medals, photos, and a replica of the chained doors. Tour guides, often veterans, walked visitors through the story, ending with the Hale Act. Naomi attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Isaiah clutching her hand. She watched as veterans saluted, townspeople applauded, and children pressed their faces to the glass to see the relics. One elderly man, a Korean War veteran, shook her hand afterward. "Your husband gave his life," he said, "but you gave us his voice." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "I only carried what he left behind." Meanwhile, universities invited Naomi to guest lecture, not just about Marcus, but about resilience and civic duty. At first, she hesitated. She still saw herself as an ordinary woman, not a professor. But standing before students, she found her words carried weight. "Laws can be written," she told them, but it's stories that make us remember why laws matter. My husband's story is one. Yours can be another. Don't wait for chains to test your courage. The students erupted in applause, some wiping tears. Naomi left the lecture hall humbled but also aware. She had become not just a witness but a teacher. Not all attention was easy. Some critics argued that Marcus's story was being overused, or that Naomi's presence overshadowed other families. Articles debated whether grief had become spectacle. Naomi read some of them late at night, her heart heavy. She turned off the screen and whispered to herself, "This was never about fame, it was about Marcus." Dana reassured her the next day. "People will always argue, Naomi, but remember, you didn't chase the spotlight. It chased you, and you used it for good." Naomi nodded, trying to hold on to that truth. Deputy Riker remained a ghostly presence in the narrative. Though he never spoke publicly, investigative articles continued to highlight his role. His name appeared in training manuals for law enforcement, a warning of arrogance and abuse of power. In quiet moments, Naomi wondered if he ever felt remorse. She never wished him ruin, but she couldn't forget the chains in his hands either. For Isaiah, the new visibility carried both pride and pressure. At school, classmates called him the Hale Act kid. Some teachers expected wisdom beyond his years. One afternoon, he came home frustrated. "Why can't I just be Isaiah?" he asked. Naomi pulled him into her lap. "You are Isaiah. You always will be. Your dad's story is part of you, but it doesn't define you. You get to write your own chapters too." Isaiah frowned, then smiled faintly. "Maybe my chapter will be about building rockets." Naomi laughed softly, hugging him tight. "Then I'll be right there cheering you on." As the months passed, Naomi sought more balance. She limited her travel, choosing events that mattered most: scholarship ceremonies, veterans rallies, school visits. The rest she politely declined. Instead, she focused on Olive Street. She started a community garden in Marcus's name, teaching Isaiah to plant tomatoes and beans. Neighbors joined, laughing together as children chased butterflies among the rows. Naomi realized then that legacy wasn't just written in laws and books. It was lived in soil, in laughter, in the rhythm of everyday life. One evening, she sat on her porch, Isaiah asleep inside, the visitor center lights glowing down the block. She pulled the casualty notice from her pocket, unfolding it slowly. Beside it, she placed a copy of the Hale Act. Her tears fell freely as she whispered, "Marcus, you've gone from a folded paper of loss to pages in history books, from chains on a door to a law protecting every soldier. And through it all, you're still mine." The night air was cool, the cicadas humming their song. Naomi felt the weight of grief, yes, but also the strength of legacy, stretching from Olive Street to classrooms, from candles to capitals. She folded the papers together, holding them against her heart. Balance was never easy, but she had found it. The widow, the mother, the symbol, the woman. And she would keep walking, one step at a time, carrying Marcus with her. By the following summer, Marcus Hale's story had traveled even further than Naomi ever imagined. The documentary still streamed on major platforms, but now, new forms of storytelling took root. A playwright in New York staged a production called The Chains at Zion, blending spoken word and gospel music to dramatize the funeral that sparked a movement. Naomi was invited to opening night. She sat in the audience, Isaiah beside her, as an actor in a crisp uniform marched solemnly across the stage. When the actress portraying Naomi raised a trembling hand against a locked church door, the theater held its breath. Isaiah squeezed his mother's hand. "That's you, Mom," he whispered. Naomi's eyes welled with tears. She whispered back, "That's all of us." When the final curtain fell, the audience rose in thunderous applause. Critics would later call it a masterpiece of dignity. For Naomi, it was a surreal experience, watching her own pain transformed into art. Beyond theater, Marcus's name appeared in literature. An anthology of essays titled The Hale Effect became a bestseller, with contributions from veterans, teachers, and activists. One chapter, written by a high school student, struck Naomi deeply. "When I read about Staff Sergeant Hale, I realized history isn't just about battles long ago. It's about people today who fight in different ways. He fought with his life. His wife fought with her voice. Now we fight with our choices." Naomi read the words aloud to Isaiah one evening. "See, baby? Your daddy's story is helping kids your age see their own strength." Isaiah grinned. "Maybe I'll write my own chapter one day." Even Hollywood took notice. Rumors spread that a studio planned to adapt Marcus's story into a feature film. Naomi received calls from producers, but she hesitated. "I don't want them to turn it into spectacle," she told Dana. "I can handle a play, a book, a documentary, but a blockbuster? That feels too far." Dana replied gently, "Then you set the boundaries, just like before. If you don't, someone else will." Naomi sighed, realizing she would once again have to walk the line between public legacy and private memory. Meanwhile, Olive Street's transformation deepened. The visitor center expanded with new exhibits, including artifacts loaned by Marcus's old unit. Veterans from across the country brought medals, letters, even boots worn in combat. "We want to honor him by honoring all of us," one explained. Pastor Givens organized an annual memorial walk each July, retracing the path of Marcus's funeral procession from the church to the cemetery. Hundreds joined, carrying candles and flags. Naomi and Isaiah always walked at the front, Isaiah holding his father's photo high. The first year, Naomi struggled with tears. By the second, she found herself smiling through them. The walk wasn't just grief. It was community, solidarity, celebration. Deputy Riker's name, however, faded into history differently. Training programs across the country used his actions as a case study, a cautionary tale of prejudice and abuse of power. He never appeared in public again. His legacy was silence and disgrace, forever overshadowed by the light of the story he tried to suppress. Naomi rarely thought of him anymore. Marcus's story was no longer defined by chains, but by the breaking of them. For Isaiah, growing up under the weight of legacy was complicated. One afternoon after school, he asked, "Mom, do I have to be a hero too?" Naomi knelt, holding his shoulders. "You already are, baby, but not because of what people expect. Because of who you are. You get to choose your path. Daddy would want that for you." Isaiah considered this, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe I'll be an astronaut. Daddy can watch me from the stars." Naomi laughed through tears, hugging him tightly. "And I'll be cheering from here." Naomi continued to speak at select events, but she also began saying no more often. She realized the story didn't need her voice every time. It had grown strong enough to stand on its own. Instead, she focused on nurturing her community. She expanded the scholarship fund, mentored young widows, and volunteered at the community garden. She found joy in small acts of kindness, cooking meals for neighbors, teaching Isaiah to bake his father's favorite cornbread. It was these ordinary moments, she realized, that kept Marcus alive as much as the headlines ever did. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, Naomi sat on her porch with Isaiah. The candles at Zion still burned, though fewer now, no longer a protest but a tradition. "Mom," Isaiah asked, "do you think people will still remember Daddy in 100 years?" Naomi gazed at the glowing church steps, at the plaque etched with Marcus's name, at the memory written into books and plays and laws. "Yes, baby," she said softly, "because his story isn't just about him anymore. It's about everyone who believes dignity can't be chained." Isaiah leaned against her shoulder, satisfied. Naomi closed her eyes, breathing in the night air. Grief was still there, but it had changed shape. Less a weight, more a companion. And in its place, pride had grown strong. Marcus's story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to the world. By the next Memorial Day, the Hale family's story had become woven into the fabric of national remembrance. Across the country, parades carried banners with Marcus's name. At cemeteries, speakers referenced the Hale Act alongside the sacrifices of countless others. Naomi woke early that morning, Isaiah still asleep, and stood quietly in front of the folded flag on her mantle. She traced its stars with her fingers, whispering, "This year, they march for you." When she and Isaiah arrived at the national ceremony in Washington, the scale took her breath away. Rows of chairs stretched across the mall, veterans in every uniform. Gold Star families seated with solemn dignity. At the front, a podium bore the presidential seal. Secretary Ellison greeted Naomi warmly. "Today, Marcus's name will be read with the nation's greatest heroes." Naomi swallowed hard. "He never asked for that." Ellison smiled gently. "Heroes never do." The ceremony began with the toll of bells, echoing through the Capitol. A choir sang the national anthem, voices soaring into the clear May sky. Then came the roll call of names, soldiers who had given their lives. Naomi held Isaiah's hand as Marcus's name was spoken. The crowd fell silent, then erupted into applause. Isaiah whispered, They're clapping for Daddy. Naomi squeezed his hand. Yes, baby, for Daddy and for every soldier like him. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she approached the podium with steady steps. Cameras flashed, but she didn't look at them. She looked only at the families, the veterans, the children waving flags. My husband's funeral was once nearly silenced by chains. Today I stand here to say, his name and the names of all our fallen will never be silenced again. The Hale Act was not just a law, it was a promise that dignity belongs to every soldier, every family, every time. The applause was long and thunderous. Some veterans saluted. Others simply bowed their heads, tears streaking their faces. Naomi stepped back, her heart pounding, but with a deep peace she hadn't felt in months. That evening, as fireworks lit the Washington sky, Naomi and Isaiah sat on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Isaiah leaned against her, wide-eyed at the bursts of red, white, and blue. Mom, he asked, do you think Daddy can see this? Naomi wrapped an arm around him, her gaze on the glowing sky. I think he sees every light, Isaiah, and I think every one of them is for him. Back in Olive Street, Memorial Day became an even bigger tradition. The town organized its own parade, children riding decorated bikes, veterans marching proudly. At Zion Baptist, the annual vigil grew larger, candles stretching across the lawn. Naomi stood at the front with Pastor Givens, holding Isaiah's hand. This little town has become a beacon, the pastor said. From these steps, a message went out to the world. Dignity is not optional. Naomi smiled faintly. And now it comes back, full circle. The story reached into unexpected corners of American life. A country singer released a ballad called The Locked Door, its lyrics telling Marcus's story. A tech company sponsored scholarships in his name. Even a video game included a mission inspired by his funeral, teaching players about respect and service. Naomi sometimes felt dizzy at the reach of it all, but she reminded herself, behind every headline and tribute, there was still a man she loved, a boy who missed his father, and a family learning to live with both grief and pride. Deputy Riker remained in exile, his name absent from ceremonies, his role remembered only in caution. When journalists tried to track him down, he refused interviews. The contrast between his silence and Naomi's steady voice grew sharper each year. Naomi no longer thought of him often. She realized justice wasn't about punishing him forever. It was about ensuring Marcus's honor lived on. And it did. One evening after returning from Washington, Naomi sat with Dana on her porch. Fireflies blinked in the humid air, Isaiah chasing them with a jar. You've gone from Olive Street to Geneva to the National Mall, Dana said softly. Do you ever stop and think about how far you've come? Naomi chuckled lightly. Sometimes, but mostly I think about how far Marcus carried me before I ever stood alone. Dana squeezed her hand. You've carried him just as far. Naomi gazed at the glowing candles outside Zion. Then maybe we've carried each other. As summer settled in, Naomi felt a shift deep within. The grief was still there, but lighter now, softened by the knowledge that Marcus's story had become a part of the nation's story. His name was read at ceremonies, carved into plaques, sung in songs. Yet in the quiet moments, Isaiah's laughter, the smell of fresh cornbread, the creak of the porch swing, Naomi kept the parts of him that belonged only to her. She realized then that Marcus had not just left her a folded flag, he had left her a legacy to live, a movement to nurture, and a son to guide. And with each candle lit, each door opened, each name remembered, she carried him forward, steady, unbroken, unchained. The second anniversary of Marcus's death arrived with a golden sunrise over Olive Street. The air was heavy with summer heat, but also with anticipation. For weeks, the town had been preparing a new memorial park adjacent to Zion Baptist. Veterans planted trees, children painted murals, and masons laid a path of bricks engraved with names of local service members. At the center stood a tall granite monument etched with Marcus's likeness in uniform. Beneath the words, "Dignity is not optional." Naomi stood before it with Isaiah, who was taller now, his boyish features beginning to sharpen into adolescence. He traced the carved lines of his father's face with his small hand. "He looks strong, Mom," he whispered. Naomi nodded, her throat tight. He was. And now everyone who comes here will see that too. The dedication ceremony drew people from across the nation. Buses arrived filled with veterans, students, and Gold Star families. Reporters lined the streets, but this time Naomi didn't shy away. She wore a simple navy dress, the folded flag pinned close to her heart, and walked hand in hand with Isaiah to the front row. Pastor Givens opened the service. 2 years ago, this town watched a funeral nearly stolen by chains. Today, we stand in a park where those chains have been broken forever. We dedicate this place not only to Marcus Hale, but to the dignity of every soldier, every family, every citizen who believes honor must prevail. The crowd erupted in applause. Veterans saluted, children waved flags, and Isaiah held his head high. When Naomi stepped to the podium, the crowd hushed. She looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, and felt a deep calm. 2 years ago, I thought my world had ended. I stood outside a locked church, clutching a flag and a folded notice, wondering how to bury my husband with chains across the door. But what began as humiliation became transformation. Because you, all of you, stood with me. You carried Marcus's name farther than I ever could alone. She held up the Hale Act, framed in her hand. This law was born from pain, but it lives as promise. And this monument, these bricks, this park, they are not about chains, they are about doors opened. Forever. Tears streamed freely across the crowd. Naomi's voice steadied as she turned toward the monument. Marcus, you were always mine, but now you belong to the nation too. And the nation will not forget. Isaiah joined her at the podium unexpectedly, tugging her sleeve. She bent down and he whispered, "Can I say something?" The crowd chuckled softly as Naomi lifted him to the microphone. Isaiah cleared his throat nervously, then said, "My dad was brave. He taught me to ride my bike, to whistle, and to never give up. When the doors were locked, my mom didn't give up either. And now I won't either. I'll make him proud." The audience roared with applause, many wiping tears. Naomi hugged her son tightly, whispering, "You already have." Later that evening, after the crowds dispersed, Naomi walked alone through the park. The granite monument glowed softly in the twilight, candles flickering at its base. She sat on a bench beneath a newly planted oak, the folded flag in her lap. The cicadas hummed, the air warm and still. Naomi closed her eyes, remembering Marcus's laugh, his steady hand on her shoulder, the way he used to hum gospel hymns under his breath. "Marcus," she whispered, "we did it. Your story is everywhere now. Laws, books, plays, classrooms. But here, it's still just us." A breeze stirred the branches above, rustling the leaves like an answer. Naomi smiled through tears, feeling both grief and peace at once. That night, Isaiah joined her on the porch. He pointed at the glowing park down the block. "Mom, it looks like the whole town is a candle." Naomi wrapped an arm around him. "That's because one candle can light 1,000 more. Your dad lit the first. Now it will never go out." Isaiah leaned against her shoulder, eyes closing as he drifted toward sleep. Naomi held him close, gazing at the horizon. She realized then that the journey wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about every soldier, every family, every citizen who believed dignity was worth defending. The Hale story had become their story too. And yet, within that vast legacy, she still had her own private truth. Marcus's memory, Isaiah's laughter, and the quiet strength to carry both. As the stars emerged, Naomi whispered one last promise into the night. "No more chains, Marcus. Not for you, not for anyone, ever again." The wind carried her words, blending them with the glow of candles and the hum of cicadas. And in that moment, Olive Street wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a monument, living, breathing, unchained forever.